YouTube, finally, it's coming. That's right. Very first matchup of the day on Championship Sunday. We are finally at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time gonna get to see the Atlanta FaZe versus the Chicago Huntsmen. I cannot wait to actually break that down, get it all laid out for you, explain to you who I think is gonna win and all of that sort of stuff. But first, let's go through, let's break down what happened on Saturday and get us ready for the matchups on Championship Sunday. At 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I'm going to be breaking down the highlights leading into the very first matchup is the Chicago versus Atlanta matchup is 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. At 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I'm going to go live on Twitch. It's at IconNationYT right there underneath my finger. We did this on Saturday and we had about 70 to 80 people tuned in. I went through, I looked at what maps Chicago played best on Friday, and that kind of led us into our predictions for Saturday. So I'm going to be doing the same thing. I'm going to take the maps that Chicago played best on Saturday. I'm going to take the maps that Atlanta played best on Saturday. We're going to look at both of those, and it's going to lead us up through our predictions, through the start of the broadcast at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So when you come down here to the semifinals in the bottom left, I actually ended up getting all four of these teams correct, but it was just in a little bit of a different order. So if we start with what happened in Group A up here, this first matchup, I just figured that Toronto wouldn't have been able to hang with Atlanta yet. I think that they're getting closer, but I wasn't sure that they were there yet, and I was wrong. So the team that makes it through, that goes 2-0 in Group A, is actually the first team listed in the semifinals. So that's going to put Toronto up top. Then Atlanta ended up making their way through the losers bracket. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to put Atlanta down there. We can move this one back over to the left. And then the same thing happened over in Group B. I really thought that New York is just the way that they played on Saturday. They were going to come out, they were going to beat Chicago, and Chicago's S&D has looked entirely different than it did previously. So the first team through in Group B goes on top of the bottom down here. Then New York ended up making it through, and we'll talk through all of this, but New York ended up making it through the losers bracket. So Chicago we can put back, which means we have to put New York into the losers bracket final, which they ended up winning. And then we also have to put Atlanta through to the losers bracket final over here. So this is what our semifinals looked like. We're going to have Toronto versus New York. We're going to have Chicago versus Atlanta, with the very first matchup being Chicago and Atlanta. Just to kind of go through what happened on Saturday very briefly, I won't go through it all. In this first matchup, again, Toronto ended up beating Atlanta 3-2. And the interesting thing about this is that if you were to just look at the KDs for this matchup, everybody across this entire match for Toronto went negative. Every single person had a sub-1 kill death. Whereas if you look up above, Abizi had like a 1.4 and Celium had a 1.2. But the difference maker was that Toronto won both search and destroys. So even though when it came to the hard points and the dominations, they didn't play all that great, that's really where those KD discrepancies came in. It came down to the search and destroys, and Toronto having all those players on their roster, obviously they get a little bit more time to scrim and work on strategies and stuff like that. So congratulations to Toronto. They were the first team through up above. After that, we went over across to Chicago versus New York. And again, we're seeing the difference between having Arcides and Formal being those two main players that run the AR. Now, also, Pristini was also running the AR quite a bit, so they had that 3 AR meta, basically what every team is doing at the moment. But this has proven to just give Chicago a little bit of an edge in places where they might not have had before, and most notably in Search and Destroy. So, again, Game 2, the Ramaza Search and Destroy, Chicago won 6-1. Then it went to Game 5. They won the Gunrunner Search and Destroy 6-3, and Arcides had a 1.0 KD, Formal had a 1.1. Those two were really leading the charge, and it just makes things harder. So this is now the second day in a row where Envoy has had a sub-1 KD, and that's like preposterous to think about, right? Because we hadn't really seen that yet. But Envoy and Scum both had a sub-1 KD, but you're going to be seeing that a lot out of SMG players because it really is an AR player's world right now. I mean, the 3 AR meta, that's where teams are going. So Chicago ended up being the first team through. As we go back across, this is the other one that I got wrong. Paris, for the first time since April, actually won a match here. So I'm happy for Paris. I was a little bit surprised because LAG had been playing really well. They played Atlanta tough on Friday, and their last couple tournament appearances have looked fairly strong, but Paris got it done. They ended up winning this one 3-0. All of these were super close. It's not like they blew them out by any means. It's not like all of a sudden Paris came out and they just blew LAG out of the water. The Ramaza Hardpoint, they won by 20. The Petrograd S&D, they won 6-5 in round 11. And then the Petrograd Dom, they won by about 8 points. So this was all close across the board, but good for Paris. It's the first time in a few months that they've actually gotten a victory, and they desperately needed that. So good for Paris. As we go back across, next thing we had is London versus Minnesota, and I correctly predicted London to beat Minnesota in the losers bracket here. Again, this is another tournament where Minnesota went 0-2. They didn't win a single matchup, didn't win any CDL points. I'm not sure quite what's going on with them. I think that they're close. They're just not quite making the decisions that they need to make. They're not getting those critical kills in those important times. And London ended up winning this. It did go to a map 5. They won the Ramaza Search and Destroy in map 5. They won it 6-4. But overall, London, again, Wuskin had a 1.5 KD. He absolutely went off. And basically, all of the SMG players from London were negative. Dylan had a 0.75. Shawnee had a 0.8. Zero had a 0.8. I mean, this is kind of what you're going to be seeing from now on. I will say that up above, Assault had a 1.4 KD. So Assault and Wuskin were pretty much toe-to-toe in what they did in this matchup. And it really did just come down to the decision-making in the Search and Destroy and Ramaza. The Ramaza Search and Destroy that map 5, and London ended up making it through. After that, we bounced back across. We had Atlanta versus Paris, and there wasn't really much here. Atlanta won 3-0. They won the Gunrunner Hardpoint by about 80. The Petrograd S&D was 6-3, and then the Gunrunner Dom, they won by like 30 or so. So Atlanta had a 3-0 over Paris, which put them through. And finally, we got that matchup between Chicago and Atlanta. Again, this is the first matchup. I'm going to talk about that just in a second. I just want to get through this last matchup here. Over in the losers bracket final between New York and London, this was just an impressive victory for New York. They came out, they lost a Gunrunner Hardpoint by about 35. Then they clutched up in the Petrograd S&D, won that 6-5. The Hackney Yard Domination, they won by about 40. And then the Hackney Yard Hardpoint, they won 250 to 219. But again, this was very similar to what we saw from New York in that first matchup against Minnesota on Friday. Every single person was positive. They were led by Mac with a 1.23. Temp had a 1.13. Zuma had a 1.16. But every single player from New York was positive here. When you look up above, London just had a couple players that didn't really show up, most notably Zero. In this matchup in particular, Zero ended up going 62 and 94 across the 4 maps here, which gave him a 0.6 KD, and that's just not going to get it done, right? Especially with a chance to move on to the semifinal on the line, you can't have somebody putting up a 0.66. So had they've gotten a little bit more from their 5th player, that might have made the difference. But New York ends up going through, which gives us the matchups for Championship Sunday, which is going to be Toronto versus New York, and then Chicago against Atlanta. I cannot wait. Let's talk about the matchup up above first. So Toronto and New York. This is a super tough one for me, just because in this matchup, my heart wants to go with New York, even though they haven't been as impressive in this tournament as Toronto has. With what Toronto is able to do against Atlanta, it's really hard to pick against them, but I'm just not convinced, right? Maybe it's just the fact that they don't have the flashy players or whatever. The one thing that they do have is probably the advantage in Search and Destroy. Being able to take both S&Ds, especially the map 5 S&D, which Atlanta is notorious for clutching up and winning those map 5s. So for Toronto to do that against Atlanta, I think they absolutely have the advantage in Search and Destroy. Where they don't have the advantage is I don't believe that they have the slaying advantage that New York has. In that matchup, we already talked about it a little bit earlier, but Atlanta almost everybody went positive for Atlanta. For Toronto, every single person went negative. So with this matchup, I mean, will they be able to clutch up and win the search and destroys again against New York? And then if they do that, will they be able to squeak out a respawn victory? Whereas when you're looking at what New York did the rest of the day, sure, they ended up getting beat by Chicago, but Chicago looked great in their search and destroy also. But when it came down to it, every single person against a team like London, who I don't know about you, but I would probably put London and Toronto on a pretty even playing field there. Every single person went positive for New York. It'll just come down to what maps they end up playing. I truly believe that, especially in the search and destroy. There are some maps that New York is just god awful at, like in Gunrunner for search and destroy. So it'll come down to the map vetoes and what ends up being played. But for whatever reason, I'm just going with New York here. I really do think New York is going to end up winning this one over Toronto. It'll probably be super close. If it goes to a map 5, then New York's going to have to clutch up, because the way that Toronto's been playing in search and destroy, really the way that they've been playing all year, even dating back to the very first launch weekend of the Call of Duty League, they played fantastic in search and destroy. So that's kind of their MO. They played great in search, but I don't know. I'm just feeling New York at the moment with the way Mac is playing and the kill production that they're getting from SNGs, which finally brings us to the matchup we've all wanted, Chicago versus Atlanta. So this one is tough. Just to kind of go back through this show, Chicago beat London. They beat them pretty handedly. They turned around. They beat New York. They beat them pretty handedly. They've been running that 3AR setup. Their search and destroy looks out of this world. It's definitely, if you would have said that they would be playing like this a couple weeks ago when they just looked god awful in search and destroy, I would say that you are crazy. But Chicago has been playing great in search and destroy, so that's kind of an even playing field. Even though Atlanta did lose 2 maps to Toronto, you could probably say up until this matchup with Toronto, they're probably the best search team in the game. So was it a bad day? Was it a bad matchup? Who knows what the difference was there. But I think that they're pretty even in terms of what they do from the search and destroy perspective. For me personally, I think a lot of this is going to come down to what maps are played. So let me go ahead and kind of walk this through. So when it comes to Hardpoint, there are some maps that Chicago is just fantastic on. They're the best statistical hardpoint team in the game right now. So like the Azir Cave, Chicago is 7-1. When it comes down to the Ramaza, they are 6-1. When it comes down to the Petrograd, they are 4-1. The two that they struggle at, on Gunrunner, they're 7-6, and on Hackney Yard, they're 6-4. So when it comes down to the vetoes, like in Hardpoint, will they get one of those maps, the Azir Cave, the Ramaza, or the Petrograd, that they're basically unbeatable on? Or will the vetoes come out to be Gunrunner or Hackney, where they're basically 500? For me, that's really what it comes down to, because I think these two teams are super close. I do think that the 2AR, well, I guess it's a 3AR meta, but the 2 main AR meta definitely has a little bit of a favor towards Chicago. Arcides has looked like a completely different player. Formal is Formal. You give him a little bit more of an advantage with an AR since those nerfs came through to the MP5. Formal has looked out of his mind since this meta has changed a little bit. So I do think that you have to give the AR advantage to Chicago there. Just to go through the other maps here, when it comes to domination, again, Gunrunner, Chicago's 5-1. They're 4-2 on Petrograd, and then they're only 7-6 on Hackney Yard. Whereas if you look at Atlanta, they're 9-6 on Hackney Yard. So what will the vetoes end up being? Will you play a Gunrunner or a Petrograd? Which, by the way, Atlanta is also 5-1 on Gunrunner. They're 5-2 on St. Petrograd. So for me, I do think that Atlanta, if they end up playing Hackney Yard, that's a big advantage for them. Then finally, when it comes down to search and destroy, this is where I really think the difference is going to be made. Basically across the board, Chicago's not all that great on a couple search maps. For example, on Arklov Peak, Chicago is 4-4. And Atlanta is 9-3. a big difference there. But like on Piccadilly, Chicago is 3-2. We just saw what they did against London on Piccadilly, whereas Atlanta is 4-5. So I do think there are some search maps that give Chicago a little bit of an advantage. To me, it's just all going to come down to the vetoes. What maps end up being played? Come back and think about this, because when you see that map list, if it ends up being ones that Chicago prefers, then Chicago might end up winning, especially with their AR advantage. The other thing that I'll say is that from the SNG role, Envoy and Scump have been so-so, but Abizi has been playing super well. So if they are the smaller maps that tend to play a little bit faster, like the Hackney Yards, like the Gun Runners, then you might expect that to go Atlanta's way. But if they pick maps that go with the 3AR meta, kind of the longer range maps, the Azir Caves, the Petrograds, those might go Chicago's way. So with this, I do think overall, with the meta change, with the 3ARs, again, for me, it will really come down to what maps end up being played. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to put Chicago through. I really think that they have what it takes to beat Atlanta, especially right now. Had this matchup come even like 3 weeks ago, then the story might be different. But I don't think anybody out there can debate the fact that Arcitys and Formal look like the best AR tandem in the league right now. Those two are playing out of their mind. Arcitys has been absolutely shredding, and Formal is just doing what Formal does. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to put Chicago through, which would give us a matchup between Chicago and New York. And again, this might also come down to what maps end up being played. My guess would be that the vetoes would go a little bit differently than they did the first time. You probably don't want to play Chicago on the same maps that you played them on Saturday, but I just think that they're not ready yet. I don't think that New York is ready for that moment yet. Now, if they prove that they can win there, such as like Florida did, I had these same thoughts with Florida. I didn't quite think that Florida was ready to play at that level, and now they've been winning back-to-back events, and they just look like they're a more refined team. I don't see that out of New York yet. I think they're going to put up a battle, but in the end, I think the newfound experience from Chicago, especially in Search and Destroy, is probably going to be what makes the difference in this finals matchup. And for me, I have Chicago coming through as your winner for CDL New York, with New York taking second. So if you're new around here, this is the first time you've checked out my channel, I'll put out brand new videos like this every single day. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything I put out in the future. Comments, do you agree? Do you have Huntsman winning? Do you have New York pulling through? Do you have Toronto beating New York? Do you have Atlanta winning? All of those scenarios, let me know down in the comments below. I love when you guys comment. I love reading your interactions, seeing what you guys have that's different from what I have. And without further ado, thank you guys so much for everything. Enjoy Championship Sunday. Check me out on twitch.tv/IconNationYT before the broadcast gets started. And with that, I will catch you in tomorrow's upload. Enjoy Championship Sunday from CDL New York.